Module 7. Trauma, Loss, and Grief. Module 7. Learning Objective. Describe the difference between trauma, loss, and grief. Module 7. What is trauma? Which image best represents trauma to you? Why? Module 7. Understanding trauma. To understand trauma-related behavior, it is important to observe and think through the behavior. Think about what has happened to the child or youth and how they have experienced the world. Many children in care have experienced a multitude of separations from and losses of significant persons, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, neighbors, friends, foster parents, and foster brothers and sisters. Other losses may include loss of home, homeland, community, language, culture, personal belongings, pets, personal history, and even loss of routine, school, daycare, familiar foods, smells, touches, and sounds. The list of losses for the child can be endless and can be a lonely experience. In addition to loss, the majority of children that interact with child intervention have experienced a significant amount of trauma while in their guardian's care. Module 7. 4 types of trauma. There are 4 main types of trauma. 1. Acute trauma. 2. Complex trauma. 3. Hidden trauma. 4. Intergenerational trauma. Module 7. Acute trauma. Acute trauma. Often an unexpected single event of shorter duration. The event is not intentionally focused on an individual and is usually an impersonal event. Module 7. Examples. Examples of acute trauma. Natural disasters, example flood or fire. Death of a loved one. Motor vehicle accident. Being a victim of a crime. Serious accident, example near drowning. Module 7. Complex trauma. Complex trauma. Interpersonal, multiple exposures, chronic, prolonged, longer duration and higher intensity. Can include both early and late onset. More complex when there is not supportive relationship with a caregiver or family. Module 7. Hidden trauma. Hidden trauma. Trauma is not always visible. It can include poverty, racism, homophobia, intergenerational trauma. Module 7. Intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma. Trauma can be passed on through generations. An example of this is the experience of Canada's Indigenous peoples through residential school experiences that were part of a government-created system of cultural assimilation. There were many other government-sanctioned programs and initiatives, including the 60s Scoop, reserved land, registration, enfranchisement, and more. The impact of these life-changing experiences for Indigenous people has created intergenerational trauma by Module 7. Impacts. Creating parents who parent from a state of fear and terror. Loss of love, care, teaching, and respect. Lack of physical and emotional nurturing. Removal from primary caregivers and from their communities. Punishment for core belief system. Community trauma. Trained dependency on outside structures. Module 7. Results of impacts. The result from this is higher percentages of Indigenous families struggling with issues that require healing from the history of forced separation and mistreatment. Families struggling with intergenerational harm, as evidenced by high incidences of substance use, poor health, abuse, and concerns with child intervention. Subsequent generations removed from their families and placed in temporary or permanent care, perpetuating the cycle. Module 7. Quote, Dr. Danna Bodenheimer. A lot of people describe grief as a form of trauma. Sometimes grief does become trauma, and often it does not. Our ability to remain squarely in the realm of grief often rests on how much meaning we can make of the loss and how openly we are able to discuss and process it over a lengthy period of time. Module 7. Trauma and Grief. Trauma can become grief, and grief can become trauma. So when does this happen? When trauma creates a loss, a grief process will happen. When grieving happens without supports or coping mechanisms, trauma can occur. Module 7. Symptoms of grief. The symptoms of grief can re-emerge when something reminds a person of their loss, at different developmental stages, during certain events in a person's life. Module 7. Model of grief cycle. We used to think that people progressed through stages of grief in an almost linear fashion based on Kubler-Ross's 5-stage model of grief cycle from 1969. There was an understanding that we progressed through the steps in a sequential and ordered fashion, that once you went through a stage, you didn't re-experience that phase. This framework provided us a way to learn to live with our loss. Module 7. Grief is different for everyone. While the 5 stages of grief still have relevance, we now know that it is not a neat, linear process. It is a confusing and unique experience for each person. Grief can manifest in a number of ways, and a grieving person can be in and out of various stages. The grieving responses can be hard to see and understand. Grief will look and feel different for each individual depending on a number of factors. Module 7. Grief and Loss. The degree of loss does not determine the level of grief experienced. This is because the grief experience also takes into account prior losses and fears about future losses. There are 2 critical messages to remember. Module 7. Grieving is healthy. 1. The important thing is that we allow each child or youth the opportunity to grieve in a healthy way that will comfort them. Module 7. Acknowledge loss. 2. We need to acknowledge the pain and help them understand what has happened and what will happen. Module 7. Grief is different for everyone. Grief will look different in each individual child depending on how well the adults understand grieving and trauma, how the adults manage or respond to the loss, how well they know or feel connected to the people they are placed with, how familiar the home environment is, how familiar the community and culture are. Module 7. Key Messages. Key messages to remember. It's incredibly important to recognize that the experience of trauma is very individualized. It depends upon the individual's perception of the event and the processing of that event as threatening and their feeling of helplessness. Not everyone is affected in the same way by similar events and experiences. For example, a car accident may be traumatic for one individual, but less so for someone else. Module 7. Test yourself. Which statement best describes complex trauma? A. Interpersonal. B. Natural disasters, example, flood or fire. C. Creating parents who parent from a state of fear and terror. D. The event is not intentionally focused on an individual and is usually an impersonal event. The following statement best describes complex trauma. A. Interpersonal. Complex trauma. Interpersonal. Multiple exposures, chronic, prolonged, longer duration and higher intensity. Can include both early and late onset. More complex when there is not supportive relationship with a caregiver or family. Module 7. Trauma, Loss, and Grief. Congratulations! You've completed Module 7. Next, Module 8, The Impact of Trauma.